Forensic analysis determined the bones were approximately 40 years old. The individuals had been male between 20 and 40 years old and showed signs of malnutrition. But here's the strange part. There were no personal effects, no clothing, no identification, nothing. And the burial pattern was unusual. The bodies had been placed in a mass grave, stacked on top of each other, no coffins, no ceremony, no respect. It was, one forensic expert noted, consistent with the hurried disposal of bodies that weren't supposed to be found. Local historians connected the site to the POW camp. They filed requests for military records. Most of those records were classified. The few that were released had pages missing. The remains were eventually reburied in a local cemetery. A small stone marker was placed. It reads, "Unknown soldiers, may they rest in peace." But who were they? Why were they buried like that? What happened to them? No one will say. And Pennsylvania isn't the only place. Similar discoveries have been made in New York, Louisiana, Texas, New Mexico. In each case, unmarked graves, bodies with no identification, locations suspiciously close to former POW camps. In each case, official silence. The Department of Defense has consistently denied any wrongdoing. All prisoners of war, they insist, were treated in accordance with international law. All Soviet citizens were repatriated as agreed upon at Yalta. But the evidence suggests otherwise. Researchers have found discrepancies in the numbers. Camp rosters that list Russian prisoners arriving, but no records of them leaving. Transfer orders that reference special handling and classified destinations. Medical reports that suddenly end, with no explanation of what happened to the patient. Death certificates that were never filed. It's as if these men simply ceased to exist, erased from history with the stroke of a pen. Why? What was the government trying to hide? One theory is that some of these prisoners died of natural causes, disease, malnutrition, injuries sustained before capture, and the military simply didn't want to deal with the diplomatic complications. If Soviet citizens died in American custody, it would create problems. Stalin would demand explanations. He might use it as propaganda. It was easier to just make the bodies disappear. But that doesn't explain the secrecy that continues to this day. Natural deaths wouldn't require classified records 70 years later. Another theory is more sinister. It suggests that some Russian prisoners were used for medical experiments. This sounds like conspiracy theory, except that we know the United States government did conduct unethical experiments during and after World War II. The Tuskegee syphilis study, the plutonium injection experiments, the CIA's MK-Ultra program. Is it really so unbelievable that some Russian prisoners, men who officially didn't exist, men who no one would miss, were used as test subjects? There's circumstantial evidence. Documents that reference medical research on prisoners. Requests for special subjects with specific physical characteristics. One declassified memo from 1946 mentions a project to study the effects of extreme cold on human subjects. It notes that foreign nationals in custody might be suitable for such research. The memo doesn't specify which foreign nationals, but given the context, given the timing, the implications are chilling. Were Russian prisoners subjected to freezing experiments, radiation exposure, drug trials? We don't know, and perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the uncertainty, the lack of records, the missing documents, all of it is intentional. Plausible deniability. Then there's the intelligence angle. We know that American intelligence agencies were desperate for information about the Soviet Union. The OSS, the predecessor to the CIA, was actively recruiting former Soviet citizens, people who spoke the language, who knew the culture, who had inside knowledge of Soviet military and political structures. Some Russian prisoners fit that profile perfectly, especially officers, especially those who had become disillusioned with communism. Documents released under the Freedom of Information Act show that several former Soviet soldiers were indeed recruited by American intelligence. They were given new identities, resettled in the United States or other countries. Their past was buried. These were the success stories, the men who were useful, the men who cooperated. But what about the others? The men who refused to cooperate, the men who knew too much, the men who were problematic? In the world of intelligence, loose ends are dangerous, and sometimes loose ends get tied up. Is it possible that some Russian prisoners were eliminated because they knew things the government didn't want revealed, because they could expose secrets? It's dark to think about, but history has shown us that governments are capable of terrible things when they believe national security is at stake. And in the late 1940s, with the Cold War beginning, national security concerns were paramount. Which brings us to Operation Keelhaul. This was the code name for the Allied operation to repatriate Soviet citizens. It began in 1944 and continued through 1947. The operation was supposed to be straightforward. Identify Soviet citizens, transfer them to Soviet custody. Done. But in practice, it was chaotic, brutal, and in many cases, tragic. There are documented cases of people who weren't even Soviet citizens being handed over. White Russian émigrés who had fled the Bolshevik Revolution. People born in territories that only became part of the Soviet Union after 1939. It didn't matter. If you spoke Russian, if you looked Slavic, you were sent east. Families were torn apart. Children were separated from parents. Elderly people were forced onto trains. And throughout all of this, the American military maintained detailed records, manifests, transfer orders, receipts. Except, some of those records are missing. Specific pages, specific sections, entire files. Researchers have found evidence of systematic redaction, not just censoring sensitive information, but removing entire documents from the archives. Why? What was in those documents that couldn't be revealed? One former archivist, speaking off the record, said he once saw a file marked Operation Keelhaul Special Cases. Inside were names and photographs of Russian prisoners. Each entry had a stamp resolved. He asked his supervisor what resolved meant. The supervisor took the file away. He never saw it again. Resolved. What does that mean? Successfully repatriated, recruited by intelligence, or something else? We may never know. But let's talk about the survivors, because not all of these men died. Not all of them were sent back. A very few, managed to slip through the cracks. In the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, some incredible stories began to emerge. An elderly man living in a small town in Russia came forward. He claimed he had been held in an American POW camp after the war. He said he was part of the Russian Liberation Army. When he surrendered to American forces, he begged not to be sent back to the Soviet Union. The Americans, he said, kept him for nearly 2 years. He was interrogated repeatedly about his experiences, about Soviet military tactics, about his reasons for joining Vlasov. He cooperated fully. He told them everything he knew. And then one day, without warning, he was released. Not sent back to Russia, not deported, just released. He was given civilian clothes, a small amount of money, and a warning. Never speak of this. If you do, we'll find you. He made his way to Canada, then to Argentina. He lived under a false name for decades. He married, had children, built a new life. Only after the Soviet Union collapsed, when he felt it might be safe, did he return to Russia, and only then did he tell his story. How many others are there? How many men living quiet lives, under assumed names, carrying secrets they were told to never reveal? Another survivor, found living in Australia, told a similar story. He claimed he was part of a group of 12 Russian prisoners held at a camp in the American Midwest. They were kept isolated, interrogated, and then something happened. One by one, men started disappearing from their group. The guards said they were being transferred, but no one believed that. The man said he became convinced they were being killed. He decided to take a chance. During a work detail, he ran. He made it into the countryside. He hid in barns and freight trains. Eventually, he made it to the West Coast. With the help of sympathetic Russian émigrés, he secured false papers. He boarded a ship to Australia, and he never looked back. I was lucky, he said. Most weren't. When asked if he had proof, he had none, just his memories, and the scars. He rolled up his sleeve to show marks on his wrists. From the handcuffs, he said. They kept us shackled at night. Are these men telling the truth, or are they embellishing, creating drama from faded memories? It's hard to say with certainty. Memory is fallible, especially memory of traumatic events. But the consistency of the stories is striking. The details match. The timelines align. The emotions are raw and real. And then there's the physical evidence. In 2012, a journalist investigating this story received an anonymous package. Inside was a set of dog tags, Russian names, serial numbers that matched the format used by the Russian Liberation Army. Also in the package was a photograph, faded, creased. It showed a group of men in prison uniforms. Behind them was a barbed wire fence. In the background, barely visible, was a sign. The journalist had it enhanced. The sign read, Camp Rustin, United States Army. The journalist tried to trace where the package came from. The postmark was from New Mexico, but there was no return address. No note. Just the dog tags and the photograph. He published the photograph in an article. Within days, he received a cease and desist letter from the Department of Defense. The photograph, they claimed, was classified material. Its publication was a violation of national security. But how could a 70-year-old photograph of prisoners be a national